everyone. Today we're going to discuss Anna Kavan's short story, A Bright Green Field. As in the previous two videos, in this one, I would like to help you think about how you might close read this short story to develop your own interpretation of it, as this is the last of the three stories about which you might write your close reading essay. Before we get to the story, though, again, I'd like to give you a little context for it. Anna Kavan was one of the most mysterious authors of the 20th century. Anna Kavan wasn't her real name. She was born Helen Woods in 1901 to a wealthy British family that over the course of her childhood appears to have lost a lot of its money. She published a number of books under her real name, and she was moderately successful as a novelist, but her life was very difficult. She had 2 failed marriages, one of her children died, she suffered from severe depression, and she became addicted to heroin. When she was in her late 30s, she attempted suicide, and she was institutionalized, and after she was released, she legally changed her name to Anna Kavan, which was the name of a character in one of her earlier novels. She wrote a book of short stories based on her experiences in the institution, titled Asylum Piece, and her writing style radically changed, becoming far more dreamlike and experimental. She spent the rest of her life writing and publishing under the name Anna Kavan, struggling with depression and heroin addiction, spending time in sanatoriums, and never really having great success as a novelist until her final novel, Ice, was published in 1967. The very next year, however, she died. There has recently been a resurgence of interest in her work, though. Her novel Ice was re-released as a Penguin Classic in 2017. A new edition of her short stories, titled Machines in the Head, just came out this year. And there have recently been a number of critical essays published about her in major magazines like The New Yorker, which is how I discovered her work. I think one of the reasons there's been a resurgence of interest in her work is that the themes of her strange stories suddenly seem very relevant. We discussed in the last video how fiction can help us think about bigger psychological, social, cultural, and philosophical questions. And I think that we'll see that A Bright Green Field can help us to think about some major questions facing human beings today. Also, if in our discussion of The Fears of Mrs. Orlando and our discussion of The Debutante, we focused primarily on perspective, I think it might make sense in our discussion of A Bright Green Field to focus on imagery and the role imagery plays when we produce a literary interpretation. After all, the narrator is haunted by an image, and she spends a lot of time thinking about what that image suggests to her. What is the image that haunts her? It's the sight of a meadow. The meadow is always beautifully green. In the dusk, it looks almost incandescent, almost a source of light, as though the blades of grass themselves radiated brightness. The vividness of the grass is always what strikes people first. It takes them a moment longer to notice that, as a matter of fact, the green is rather too intense to be pleasant, and to wonder why they did not see this before. The observation once made, it becomes obvious that for grass to be luminiferous is somewhat improper. It has no business to advertise itself so ostentatiously. Such effulgent luster is unsuited to its humble place in the natural order, and shows that in this meadow the grass has risen above itself, grown arrogant, aggressive, too full of strength. What's disturbing about this image? The grass seems to be emitting light, though it isn't really. Still, in the evening sunlight, it looks too bright, too noticeable, so noticeable it almost seems arrogant, as the narrator says, or aggressive, like it's attempting to make its presence known. Is the grass really strange? Or is the narrator just herself looking at it too closely? We can't really say. But what's significant, I think, is precisely that the narrator is noticing the grass. Grass is something I think that most of us see everywhere without really noticing it or paying much attention to it. But suddenly, when this narrator notices it, the fact that it is alive and growing and everywhere makes her uneasy. There is a hint in the descriptions of the brightness of the grass that it is somehow threatening. The setting sun makes it scintillate like a green flame. And that might lead her and us to the bizarre idea of green fire burning everything down. The story proceeds to give us increasingly strange images of the relationship between this grass and human beings. When the narrator gets off the train in the small town, the field was still in full view when I emerged from the station, a spectacular, vivid background to the little town, of which it appeared to be an important feature, the various buildings having been kept low and grouped as if to avoid hiding it. Now that I was able to look more carefully, and without the distorting and distracting effect of the train's motion, I recognized the peculiar scattered shapes I had already noticed as prone, half-naked human bodies, spread-eagled on the glistening bright green wall of grass. The field of grass appears to be bigger than the town. The buildings of the town, as she writes, have been kept low and grouped as if to avoid hiding the field of grass. Almost as if the people who built the town knew, unconsciously, the grass was important and dangerous and did not want to offend it. And against the grass, human beings look only like, as she writes, peculiar scattered shapes. Human beings don't look like the most important figures in this town. Compared to the grass, they don't look like complex, rational beings, but only shapes. In terms of the story's imagery, the grass is overwhelming everything that we would usually consider most important: human beings, culture, civilization. And we now come to the story's strangest image, I think, which I actually find really disturbing, although I can't really say why I do. I just don't like it. It makes me uneasy. The image of human beings working to cut the grass on this very steep slope, being held in place as they work with their scythes by a complicated system of pulleys that jerks their bodies around. They were bound to it by an arrangement of ropes and pulleys that slowly drew them across its surface, and had semicircular implements of some sort fastened to their hands, which they continually jerked in a spasmodic fashion, reminding me of struggling flies caught in a spider's web. This tormented jerking, and the fact that the grotesque, sprawling figures were chained to the tackle pulling them along, made me think they must be those of malefactors undergoing some strange, archaic form of punishment, conducted in public up there on the burning green field. In this description, the workers are compared to flies caught in a spider's web and criminals undergoing a bizarre punishment. We get images of captured flies and prisoners, images of organisms that are under the control of larger forces. Later, she even compares them to twitching marionettes. The workers whose job it is to control the grass are compared to things that are not in control, that are being controlled. In their attempt to control the grass, the human beings in this story do not look powerful or even capable. In describing the relationship between the human beings and the grass in this story, the story finally brings up images of war. All at once, I found myself listening to the intense stillness, aware of some suspense in the ominous hush of impending thunder. Not a sound came from anywhere. There was no sign of life in the street, where the lights had not yet come on, in spite of the gathering shadows. Already the houses around me had lost their sharp outlines and seemed huddled together, as if nervously watching and waiting and holding their breath. Mist and twilight had blotted out colors. All shapes were blurred and indefinite, so that the clear-cut bright green field stood out startlingly, mysteriously retaining the light of the departed day concentrated in its small rectangle, floating over the roofs like a bright green flag. The bright green field above the town resembles a flag raised over the town. When a flag is raised over a town, what does that mean? The town has been taken over by an invading army. And the buildings of the town, as night falls, resemble people who have been conquered and who are frightened. They seem huddled together, as if nervously watching and waiting and holding their breath. Now, what's really interesting about this story, and what makes it a good story with which to discuss imagery, is that the narrator is presented with these strange images, like we, as readers, are presented with them, and she then considers what these images suggest to her, or might mean to her, or make her think about. in the same way we, as readers, might consider what these images bring into our own minds. Having seen this strange field in this town, the narrator has a vision of the grass as always alert, continually on the watch for a momentary slackening of the effort to check its growth, only awaiting that opportunity to burst all bounds. I saw the grass rear up like a great green grave, swollen by the corruption it had consumed, sweeping over all boundaries, spreading in all directions, destroying all other life, covering the whole world with a bright green pall beneath which life would perish. That poison green had to be fought, cut back, cut down, daily, hourly, at any cost. There was no other defense against the mad proliferation of grass blades, no other alternative to grass, blood-bloated, grown viciously strong, poisonous and vindictive, a virulent plague that would smother everything, everywhere, until grass and grass only covered the face of the globe. She imagines grass growing over and taking over the entire world. And she doesn't know if what she imagines in response to this sight of this field is crazy or not. It seems monstrous, a thing that should never have been possible for grass to possess such power. It is against all the laws of nature that grass should threaten the life of the planet. How could a plant meant to creep, to be crushed underfoot, grow so arrogant, so destructive? At times the whole idea seems preposterous, absolutely crazy, a story for children, not to be taken seriously. I refuse to believe it. And yet, one can't be quite certain. In the end, she can only conclude one simply doesn't know what to believe. So, this story has given the narrator a series of strange images, a strange field of grass that workers are using strange methods to try to control, and these strange images have given rise in her mind to strange, maybe crazy thoughts. That's sort of like the process you undergo as you read this story, or any interesting story. The story's imagery gives rise, in your mind, to what might be strange or unusual, or at least new thoughts. Now, having encountered the images in this story, and also the narrator's own thoughts about those images, what are we, as readers, left thinking about? What thoughts have come into our heads after reading this strange story? That depends on you as a reader. This story might seem just strange to you, or it might seem to make other questions, bigger psychological, social, cultural, and philosophical questions, clearer to you. Here's one of the reasons why I think Anna Kavan's work is becoming popular again. This story, like a number of her stories, presents us with images of human civilization being overwhelmed by natural forces. We are currently living through a climate crisis, with the global temperature heating, causing polar ice to melt, weather patterns to shift, hurricanes to become bigger and more frequent, wildfires to become more widespread and frequent, droughts to become longer and more dangerous. And we are entering a situation where the natural world is maybe looking more and more like something we can no longer control, like a threat to us. By close reading a story like this one, however strange it is, we might have new and maybe clearer and maybe sharper thoughts about what our current relationship to nature is. This story might show us something about, or help us think about, or think through how our relationship to nature is changing. The story might suggest something to us about our relationship to nature. What does this story suggest about our relationship to nature? For me, this story suggests that things in nature we never really thought about as particularly dangerous, like heat or rain or a dry spell, might become quite dangerous to us, like the grass in this story. But what this story suggests to you depends on what you make of it, how you close read it, in a similar way to how the sight of the strange field causes the narrator to have her own particular new thoughts. I don't know what this story ultimately means. I don't know what the other two that we read ultimately mean either. How we're supposed to feel about Mrs. Orlando, whether there's any hope for the debutante to escape. I don't know if they ultimately mean anything. But that's why I like these stories. That's why I like all the novels and short stories I like. Because I can't figure them out, I keep thinking about them, and I keep having new thoughts. That's also why this story and the other two are good to write about, I think. By close reading them and offering your own interpretation of them, you might also offer a real insight into a bigger psychological, social, cultural, or philosophical question in your own close reading essay.